the way the regulators get involved. The regulators there are more like, here's what we think's a problem. You go figure it out. Our regulators in the US go, wait, what's happening? Let's do something about it. And it's a totally different approach to the same problem.
Welcome in, everybody. You're listening to Wrestling Payments, a podcast where we help payment professionals contend with the challenges of modernizing their payments operations and identifying ways to build for the future. If you're interested in payments innovation and modernization, you're in the right place. Now, let's get into it.
Welcome to Wrestling Payments. I'm here today with a special guest, a good friend, Kevin Olsen, the payments professor. Kevin, you want to just remind the audience who you are?
Well, I got to start off with my signature. Hey, everybody. I am Kevin Olsen. I am the payments professor. You'll find me out there on YouTube doing all I can to find fun and exciting ways to make payments fun, engaging, and entertaining, because payments is just phenomenal. I do happen to also work for a payments company called Pigeon that delivers faster payments options, though.
Excellent, excellent. Today, we're here to talk about a meeting we both attended. It is the Nacha Payments Alliance, and it's their international meeting, which this year took place in Berlin, Germany. Kevin, what were your thoughts on Berlin in general?
On Berlin in general, it was, wow. I mean, I get goosebumps actually kind of thinking about it, because I was so excited to go there. I'd never been to Germany, never been to Berlin. I happened to take my 14-year-old son, Liam, with me, who some people have seen on some of my older YouTube podcasts and videos. And to be able to go around the city with the history that it had was phenomenal. I mean, seeing the wall, seeing the places where the wall had been, some of that representation, I know, at least for my decade, my generation growing up, that it was just like, wow. And to see places like where Hitler died, and it to be such a non-eventful place too, was phenomenal. And and to experience payments there, that was also a bit interesting and surprising to me.
I found Berlin to be super interesting as well. I was not a big history student back in the day. I knew about the big events, but I didn't know Berlin in general. Where did it come from? How did it develop? It was really interesting, and certainly the amount of history. There's a place we went to. We had a tour guide that was actually a friend of ours, Andrew Gomez from Lippis Advisors, and he took us on an unofficial walking tour. And the thing that stuck with me was the Brandenburg Gate, and the Brandenburg Gate on top of it. And it's a gate. It's like big arches and cement and columns. And I don't know the architecture, but it had specific types of columns. And on top of this Brandenburg Gate, which I keep calling bridge, so forgive me if I say bridge, there was a statue, right? The statue was of a warrior, a woman, I think, in a chariot being drawn by 4 horses. And to find out that was stolen by Napoleon, and the Germans took it back, it was just really interesting. So it's a fun place to visit. I don't know if it's going to be on the top of my list to return to, but it was clean. It was a mix of all types of architecture. You can imagine that some buildings existed pre-international incident, let's say. And some buildings were destroyed and some buildings were built. So there's lots of hodgepodge of different architecture. And the other thing that stood out, I don't know if it stood out for you, Kevin, the business people, the people that were doing business, they don't kid around. They were 3-piece suits, middle of the day. And I can't remember the last time I wore, I think it was probably prom, where I wore a 3-piece suit. But they were dressed to the nines. But I
like that, because I'm a bow tie guy every day. So I like that. I thought that was great to see. But granted, they weren't colorful. I also noticed that. They were it was gray, black, brown suits.
Exactly right. But that was not why we were there, really. We were there to attend a meeting. And let me give you my impression of the meeting. I looked at the agenda as I was going. I'd committed to go. I looked at the agenda, and initially I was like, I don't know what I'm going to get out of this meeting, because it was heavy duty, European, and I, at the beginning of this meeting, had trouble seeing how we could connect to that information. By the end of the meeting, I can't imagine missing this meeting because it was so informative.
Joe, that's the same thing I'm telling people. I love Payments Innovation Alliance, period. The 2 US meetings are something that everybody in US payments should be going to, no doubt about it. You want to be members and you want to be involved because of what the work groups do, what the presentations we learn. But the Payments International meeting that they have once a year, this was my third one. And I go every year alone for the contacts that I'm able to make. I mean, to be able to sit there, and you got the head of EBA payments in there, the European Banking Association, for those of you who don't know, sitting there. You got the head of Dutch payments sitting there. In years previous, we've had the head of like the European ACH even in there. I mean, not just somebody that shows up and works for them, the leaders, I mean, the presidents, the CEOs of these companies are there in the same room from multiple countries. I get goosebumps just thinking about the people I'm talking to that are major decision makers for a global system.
I so appreciate that because I get starstruck. So if you weren't there, they would have said head of EBA, and I would have went, oh, head of the EBA. Oh my God. Kevin's like, hey, how you doing? I haven't seen you in a while. And introductions. It was thank you for those introductions. I would have been sitting in the back corner of the room if you weren't there.
What's nice too, that Payments Innovation Alliance did, because I know we're going to talk about what we learned in there as far as some of the material that was presented to us, but the fact that we get to sit in the room with these people is one thing, but we also get to know them. Like you said, the introductions, because I've gone years in a row, I've gotten to know them. And they even organize meals, like the no-host dinners, where we get to go and sit down and learn about these people on a somewhat personal level, but definitely deeper in a professional level of what they're looking at, what their concerns are. And Joe, I got a feeling you learned what I learned too, is they have the same issues. They may look at it differently, but they have the same issues.
Exactly. I don't know why that was a discovery, but completely, it's the same. It's the same problems, just different geo and different solutions. They definitely take a different approach. I don't know if I told you, I ran into a Brit in the lobby, and he's like, well, what are you doing here? They're very, very traveler friendly. And when I explained to him that there are 7,000 institutions in the US, he was like, he stuttered. He was like, so it's solving a problem for less than 100 financial institutions versus solving a problem for 7,000 institutions. It's different math.
Yeah, by far. And well, we learned that too in some of the sessions, because there's also different views from society on how things are going to work. Like, for example, the digital euro. When you talk digital dollar in the US, people are like, no. Digital euro there, they're like, hey, this sounds like a good idea, society-wise. So that was phenomenal. The way the regulators get involved. The regulators there are more like, here's what we think's a problem. You go figure it out. Our regulators in the US go, wait, what's happening? Let's do something about it. And it's a totally different approach to the same problem.
Really good. Do you want to talk about any session in general?
All of them? I really have to say, because I think the best place to start off with was just the way it started, fraud. When we started off on, I think I had the same thing you did on the agenda. I'm looking at the agenda, I'm like, fraud part 1, fraud part 2. Is there really that much fraud to talk about? And the answer was yes. Yes, there really was. And it wasn't a situation where we're talking about, this is the fraud that's happening. It was more like, this is what we're doing to solve for it. 2 sessions over 2 hours of here's what we see as ways to be able to resolve, to solve for, to at least lower, limit, maybe even control somewhat the frauds that's taken place.
That was one of those moments where you said it's the same problems, and I didn't realize that. We just had a bunch of episodes on elder financial abuse, which also leads to just fraud in general. Your grandson is been picked up by the police and he needs bail money right now in cash or put it on prepaid cards. The romance scams are there too. Yeah. So that was a eye-opening. Oh, it's the same crowd. They're having the same problems. Touching on that for a minute, and I certainly don't know enough about this topic, but PSD2 was really interesting because it was in my opinion, it was let the fintechs into the accounts. Let them, if it's the customer's account, let them have access if the customer wants a fintech to have access. I understood that, something the US kind of was playing with, and it's playing with more and more. The PSD3 is about and correct, really jump in if you want, Kevin, the sharing and resolving of fraud issues by identifying names. So I recently took part in some rulemaking at NACHA, and there was an initiative that fell off the most recent rule changes, but there was an initiative to kind of standardize the name in an ACH file. A lot of pushback around that. I pushed back around that. It's been doing what it's been doing for 50 years. Why change it? Well, here's why I changed it. So it definitely changed my opinion.
And you nailed it right there in saying this is what we've been doing for 50 years, because we look technology-wise going backwards, and there was a reason why we didn't want to look at names. We wanted things to be just numbers. It was so much easier for things to be able to process. But as things evolve, especially fraud, but technology to go along with it too, I know one of the things we learned in that first session was by being able to have the multiple layers of communication between different entities beyond just financial institutions, beyond just the central banks or operators too. I mean, they went levels deep with what the phone providers, they had the service providers in there too. And they would share like the name, they would share the information. And I mean, I get goosebumps thinking about it. I think it was Philip Straley, FNA, was talking about, we can now take, if information shared correctly, and detect fraud happening in one location and are able to determine it's about to happen here and here. Or we can start seeing the trends and patterns that it's actually happening across the network in multiple places. It just hasn't been reported, or other systems haven't detected it yet. And I was like, are you kidding? But he proved it. I mean, he showed it. He's like, here's how.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was another one of those. I would have never introduced myself if you weren't there. So thanks again on that one. He was a great guy too. Had dinner with him. Literally, I'm on the page, FNA Philip. So yeah. This is great. There was one more piece to that I thought was super interesting. Oh, here's another. And I've been on a couple of these international meetings as well, but I didn't put it together until this meeting. Always trying to. Do you remember Cindy Thompson from, what was it, Michigan ACH?
Yes.
She would say, when you train people, give them something that they know and then hook the new knowledge on it. So the thing I made, the connection I made this time was, imagine the US, and if payments were flowing, and we're comparing it to the EU, if payments were flowing, New York had its own currency and Massachusetts had its own currency, but they also shared a currency. Imagine the complexities around that. I didn't put together until this meeting the franc and the mark and the pound, not so much. I keep including the UK and the EU, and I know they said, yeah, we're done.
And they were there, but then they took that exit.
Yeah. And then the lira, imagining how different combinations of technically international payments flow. It was usually I'm a little cocky and I say, I know how I would fix that. I don't know how I would fix that. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm with you too, because I've tried to tell people, we look at SEPA, the European Payment Association, where they've got all these different countries able to do even instant payments. And I say, well, think about it like you just said. Think about it as the different states, because we are seeing in the US where different states are getting their own rules. They're passing their own laws that in some ways do and don't apply to payments because it doesn't trump federal regulation. But still, it shows that the need to be able to have that communication can be done because they're able to do it between different countries. I think we should be able to do it between different states. But they also stated there is a lot of political pressure, especially on the romance scams type of stuff, the AAP fraud. They do have a lot of political pressure. I feel like we have some, because we have seen at least Zelle in the news. We have seen like Bank of America, Chase having to testify before Congress on some of that stuff too. But I do think it's a little different as far as how that pressure maybe is applied.
And the other part of that conversation is one geo will have a solution in place. This is our payment system. This is how it works. And the idea that someone suggests we need to coordinate better the personalities of the different states saying, oh, well, we can do that. Our solution will work. And the next one saying, oh, yes, we agree, but we think our solution will work. That fighting of which solution wins, super interesting.
Well, and they talked about that too, that the different countries all said they had a solution. And what it took was an independent that would represent all equally. And they all finally went, okay, we'll do that.
Mm-hmm. Super interesting. I remember sitting next to you and saying, what the heck is an LEI?
Oh, yeah. Before we get to LEI, can I tell one more thing about the fraud that just blew my mind? The National Scam Prevention Centers. Like, this is a thing. I got back home, and one of the first things I do after catching up on sleep was I start researching these national scam prevention centers, especially the two that Philip mentioned, which was Malaysia and also Singapore, that they're very heavy in this. And the fact is, I did a internal white paper already for it too, that I'm going to be putting out. It is basically where you have those layers. You have the government, you have the central bank or the operator, you have the different banks that are involved, you have the service providers that are involved, and you even have the telephone companies, the technology providers that aren't even part of the payment. They're all involved, and they communicate to a central location, which is a location in these countries where citizens can call in and say, hey, I've been scammed, I've been robbed, my money was taken away, and they get immediate solutions. They show the detection rates of, kind of like I was saying earlier, seeing it before it happens, because the communication level is there. They are able to react so much faster to where they are able to get some funds back at least. They're at least able to also identify and shut down some of the mule accounts that are very popular in those. But it is also a case of they have to have those layers of identification, which leads in to that LEI you're talking about.
And you mentioned the white paper. How do you think that would work in the US if all of a sudden someone came up with, hey, you know what? We should have a national scam prevention, or I don't know, regional scam preventions. Is that in your paper? Any thoughts on that?
I didn't put too much on that subject yet, because there is, again, the difference between European views on privacy versus US views on privacy. Now, Europe was much bigger on it. Like, every time I went to any websites I've been to many times before in the US while I was over there, I have all these check boxes on how I want the cookies to be used. Like, not the same as here. Here, I just get an accept or reject, right? There, I had levels of how it could be used, because they, again, are more concerned with privacy. Yet, they're more willing to allow their data to be used in this capacity. In the US, I have found, or my experience at least has been, that more people are just too reserved to be able to allow that to be used, because they're not understanding how it's going to be used, or they're afraid that it would be used in malicious ways. But if we share that data in the right way, it's protecting everyone overall.
Yeah, I didn't realize it till you just said it, but the cookies were more complex. I went to a couple of websites and I'm like, what? I have two options here. I knew something was happening, but I didn't get to that place where, oh, I know it's happening. Interesting. So that LEI, I don't remember what it stands for.
It's legal entity identification. Because at first, if you remember too, we're very beginning of this presentation, they're showing all the different components that they can look at and identifying the payment. And I look over to you and I'm like, what's LEI? I have no idea. I don't want to sound stupid, even though I'm never afraid to ask a question in a group. Mm-hmm. And I did. I had to raise my hand and be like, hey, what is that? And so I had to write it down. But it is a legal entity identification. And the way I understood it, because we got to mention IBAN at some point in time too, that differentiates European payments big time. Is
Kevin, what is an IBAN?
It's an identificator that is used in the European markets that is unique to every individual in business. So it's basically like we have a social security number that identifies us. I think of it as being like a social security number for your banking information. So it's more than just a routing number and account number combination. It's kind of combining the two in a way so that you have a number that is uniquely you for European payments. But the LEI takes that to another level. It is basically saying it's kind of, again, similar to our routing number, accounting number combination, but it's outside of payments in a way, because the legal identification numbers that they're talking about, those entities, it's like signing up and say, as the payments professor, I do have a tax ID number that I use. So it's in a way being able to say this specialized identification for banking, along with this specialized identification for you as a business, gets added together to give yet another layer of protection to be able to help say, hey, you are or are not doing these payments.
And if I remember, this was a project, and it wasn't like this, everyone uses it, this is how it works. It was this is what we're trying to do, this is the problem it solves. And one more comment on that IBAN. I don't think anyone, even if you are a payment geek or a payment nerd, walks around and say, oh yeah, you need my routing number and account number? Here. But with that IBAN, here it is. You can take my IBAN here to use it. I want to pay a bill. I want to get a credit. That was a different feel. And the last piece of that, correct me if I'm wrong, there is a state difference, a country difference. So my UK IBAN isn't the same as if I have a French residence.
It's actually, there's an identifier within it. So similar, like I'd say for payments geeks in the US who know IAT, we have the country identification in there within the IAT. There's something very similar in the IBANs for that. So how they're distributed, how they're identified, there's actually differences in that.
Excellent. But I did, at the end of the day, after we figured out what they were talking about, I did like the concept of the LEA. Again, I don't know how we could implement that here. I know I get that question 5 times a year. Oh, can you look up that originator ID? Nope, I can't, because it's sort of made up by ODFI.
Well, see, I love that you just brought that up, because that is one of the things I didn't think of there. But since I realized it is basically like having a national database that is originator IDs. And instead of it just being assigned, well, I do the original IDs this way as an ODFI, and with this ODFI, we do it this way. It is being able to say that wherever you bank as a business, this is your originator ID, that it actually is assigned at a higher level or a more central level so that it is much more unique.
And we are not starting a US LEI business, but imagine how useful that would be in saying, hey, there's transactions over here, but there's transactions over here from the same originator. What's happening?
Joe, I don't know if your CEO listens to your podcast or mine listens to mine, but maybe we got a business idea right there. Maybe there's something, hey.
I have an investor, but yeah, we can talk offline. Can you tell me, do you recall, was this the EBA CEO that said one of the things that they keep in mind, and I have it in my notes, is they want to do 2 things. They want to do no harm, and they don't want to crowd anyone out so we could compete in the EU.
Yes, that was David. And that is exactly what he said, is they want to do no harm and do no harm is more than just not harming an individual. It is also corporate treasurers. It's also different countries and their economic systems. It's also the payment service providers. So they want to make sure everybody gets an equal stance in that. So it's like the 2 go together in a sense, and making it to where it's applicable to everybody. I mean, I really love that too. Of course, working for a fintech, I want to see it to be equal ground on what people are able to do, what people are able to offer from the top to the bottom, whether it be from the service provider to the actual consumer.
I did think that was remarkable, because I don't recall hearing that sort of motto in any other speech I've heard anywhere. So I did think that was interesting.
Well, it's great, though, it's said at Payments Innovation Alliance, because that is something that we do see, that everybody is treated equal in all of those meetings, whether it's the international or here in the States.
Yes. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Next topic you want to talk about?
Well, in the LEI too, something that came up during that was the confirmation of payee or verification of payee. They're the same thing. You'll hear them discussed a lot. I have done a lot to try and get that across at many different sessions I've done in the US. When I come across them, like, hey, people are like saying, what are we going to see in the next couple of years? The payments professors, payments predictions. It's something I get asked to do a lot. And I'm constantly telling them about confirmation of payee, verification of payee. The LEI is taking that to a higher level. It is being able to not just verify one field, it's multiple fields of verification. The way that these work, the confirmations, the verifications, are requiring the names, like we were mentioning earlier, and additional identifiers, of course. And what it will do is you go to send a payment, and this is especially important, say an instant payment, and you'll get something back before the payment sent saying, hey, this name matches who you're sending to. We're going to proceed. Or you get something back that says, you put in Joe Casali, but we're seeing ownership as Joseph Casali. Would you like to be able to continue? Or you get something back, you put in Joe Casali, but this says Kevin Olsen is the owner of the account. This is a big red flag. Something's wrong here. So it is a great system. And I love how that they are looking at implementing more of that over in the UK. And I do think we'll see it here. And we also see that this is where they are years ahead of us, that they're now taking that system and adding the extra levels to it. So from a corporate side of things, corporate treasurers, especially that LEI, something like that in the US, I think would be very helpful.
Yeah. And I remember them talking at what would I guess be our AFP, being very involved in the development of that. So all the treasurers were in on it. Wasn't like, here's a solution, you should use it. It was, let's work on this solution. And I just want to pause for a second because that was a big thought. I mean, that verification of payee, how could that improve fraud or not? And I hate when I say things that sound bad. How do you improve fraud? How do you prevent fraud? How could that add a comfort level to a pay? So many times, I know we've gotten this question with ACH. And ACH, which I love, you send into the network and then you wait. And did it get there? Did my bill really needed to get paid? Did it get there? And did it get to the right account? I make a deposit for my kid's account. And even when I'm making a over-the-counter deposit, I say, this is the right name on the account, right? So just that comfort level, I think it would be a really interesting addition to our payment system.
Joe, I completely agree. I mean, and I love ACH as well, but in what you just described is where I prefer an instant payment. But I also, anything reoccurring though, anything scheduled, I want it to be an ACH. And it's interesting mentioning ACH and rules changes coming up too, because we've got the new rules for risk management that are going to be taking place this year and in 2026. And they talk about and give examples of scams, which were the same exact scams that we heard in the LEI discussion, the same exact scams that were in the verification of payee. You got the vendor imposters, you got the CEO imposter, you got the payroll imposter things taking place, same exact things. And this is how they're solving for it. I do love though Nacha's new rules and how they're going to solve for it and what they'll be doing too, to be able to have increased monitoring in place and capabilities for RDFIs and being able to take action.
So Kevin, we're at about time, and I say time because we have in each week, we like to have Wrestling Payments likes to have half-an-hour episodes.
Okay.
But why don't we turn this into a part 2? Literally, we're going to stop this recording, start the next recording, so it cuts it up so it's convenient for the drive home. Is that okay with you?
That's perfect for me. Absolutely. I think we got a lot more to talk about.
On behalf of NEACH, your trusted resource in payments, and our guests, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning into the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to hear more about payments innovation and modernization, you can find the Wrestling Payments Podcast on the podcast page of NEACH.org or wherever you subscribe to podcasts. Just search for Wrestling Payments in your podcast app. Thanks for listening.